Some men raise a glass to close a deal. I raised mine to remember every word being said about my son in a language they thought I'd never understand. Easy, just smile and let them talk, I told myself at that table in my own conference room, the office I'd built from one truck and a toolbox 20 years ago. I wanted my son's future in-laws to feel like family. Framed job site photos on the wall that says, "We belong here," without anybody having to say it out loud. I appreciate you settling in with me for this one. Before we begin, do me a favor. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever caught someone talking about you when they thought you couldn't understand? Yes or no? I want to hear it. I read more of your comments than you'd guess. A few details in this story are fictionalized for storytelling purposes. The lesson underneath is what counts. Some men build a conference table to close deals. I built mine to sit across from two people who were about to insult everything I'd ever made, in a language they were certain I'd never learned. I was 56 years old that morning. I'd spent 22 years turning raw lumber and bare concrete into homes people raised their families in, and I had the calloused hands and the old Tacoma in the parking lot to prove it. The company I'd built from a single truck and a borrowed nail gun occupied the entire second floor of a building I owned outright in White Plains, New York. The conference room had morning light coming through east-facing windows I'd spec'd myself. The coffee was strong because I made it strong, and the architectural models under glass along the back wall were projects I'd drawn by hand before any computer told me how. My son Declan walked in first 29, broad-shouldered like me, still wearing a dusty company polo from the job site because he never could remember to change before meetings. He pulled out a chair for his fiancée with the kind of easy affection that made my chest tighten every time I saw it. Paloma came next. 27, dark eyes. A quick laugh that always found Declan first. She kissed me on the cheek as she passed, and it was the kind of warmth that made it impossible to believe she was connected to anything ugly. Then her parents. Ignacio Medina, 60, arrived in a tailored Navy suit that probably cost more than my first work truck. He extended his hand with the practiced warmth of a man who'd spent decades making people feel important, right before he took something from them. His wife, Lorraine, 57, wore a cream silk blouse and the kind of expression that made every compliment sound like she was grading you on a curve. They'd flown in from Barcelona 3 days earlier. The stated purpose was the engagement Declan and Paloma were getting married in the spring. The unstated purpose, the one wrapped in folders and talk of a family business partnership, was sitting in a stack of documents at the center of my table. You learn a lot about people when they think you can't understand them. You learn even more when you decide not to let them know. 22 years building homes with your own hands, Ignacio said, settling into his chair like he owned it. How admirable. In Spain, we say, a man's work speaks for him. I appreciate that, I said. We say something similar here, we just skip the speech and show up early. Lorraine smiled at Declan. Your father is so grounded. It's refreshing. Grounded. She said it the way you'd describe a golden retriever. We went through the folders. Partnership structure. Revenue projections. European distribution channels for Ignacio's import company. Declan leaned forward asking questions. Paloma squeezed his arm. I nodded in the right places and let the coffee go cold in my cup. Then came the break. Ignacio and Lorraine drifted toward the display corner where I kept the architectural models under glass. They stood with their backs half turned and switched to Spanish the way you switch off a light, casual, automatic. Like closing a door they assumed I couldn't open. Did you hear how he said guarantee clause? Ignacio murmured. Like a man ordering from a menu he can't read. Lorraine laughed low. Private. The kind of laugh meant for an audience of one. She pointed at the model I'd spent 4 months designing. A custom home in Westchester. My first major residential commission. Every joint, every roof line, every window placement, mine. I've been talked down to before. I've had clients call my work rustic when they meant cheap. But nobody had ever stood 6 feet from me and called my life's work garbage in a language they thought was a locked door. He probably scribbled this himself, Lorraine said in Spanish, tapping the glass with one manicured nail. Americans have no taste. They bolt cheap materials together and call it design. She was talking about 4 months of my life like it was something scraped off a sidewalk. Ignacio's cologne reached me before his chuckle did something expensive. Something that smelled like a man who'd never built anything with his own hands, telling another person that hands were the problem. I set my pen down on the table. Not hard. Not a scene, just down. The way you set something down when you've decided you're done holding it. Nobody noticed. Declan was showing Paloma something on his phone. Ignacio was still laughing. But something behind my ribs had gone very, very quiet. And what I heard in the last 5 minutes of that meeting turned quiet into something else entirely. The hardest thing I've ever done isn't framing a roof in a rainstorm or sleeping in my truck at 24. It's smiling at someone who just called my life's work garbage and shaking their hand like I meant it. I walked back to that table after the break, carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee, like nothing had changed. Ignacio thanked me with a nod. Lorraine didn't look up from her phone. I sat down and opened the next folder, and I performed warmth. Patience. The slow nodding of a man who builds things and doesn't rush, while something cold turned over behind my ribs, like an engine that wouldn't quit. I didn't learn Spanish in a classroom. I learned it the way you learn anything worth knowing, by getting screamed at until you understood every word. I was 22 when I left Westchester with $600 in a duffel bag and spent 4 years working construction sites outside Seville. Spanish foremen don't slow down for you. They don't hand you a dictionary. They point at a beam and they yell, and if you don't move fast enough, they yell louder. By my 2nd year, I was dreaming in Spanish. By my 3rd, I was arguing with electricians in dialect. I came home fluent and quiet about it. Because nobody on a job site in Westchester cares if you can conjugate a verb in 2 languages. They care if your walls are plumb. So I never mentioned it. Not to clients, not to friends, not to Declan. It wasn't a secret, it was just something that didn't come up. The way you don't mention you can swim until somebody falls in the water. Here's something about being underestimated that nobody tells you after a while. It stops hurting and starts becoming useful. Ignacio leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie a 1/4 inch, playing the generous patriarch. "Mark of a good businessman," he said. "You know when to listen more than you speak." "Yes, my father taught me that," I said. "He also taught me to remember everything I hear." Ignacio laughed. Lorraine smiled. Neither of them caught it. The meeting wound down, the way these things do, handshakes planned for next week. Vague talk about timelines. Declan pulling up calendar apps. Paloma had her arm through his, leaning against his shoulder the way she always did. And I watched them and felt something heavy settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with cold coffee. Then Ignacio put his hand on Paloma's shoulder. Casual. Fatherly. He leaned close and said something in Spanish, low enough that it was clearly meant only for her. "Are the legal papers ready? We need them before the next meeting." Paloma didn't flinch, didn't lower her voice. She answered the way you'd answer someone asking about groceries. "Next week." The attorneys said next week. This wasn't a lie told to my face with a smile so perfect you'd swear it was rehearsed in a mirror. This was worse. This was 2 people discussing something in plain sight, in a language they believed made them invisible, while my son stood 3 feet away planning his future with a woman whose father was preparing legal documents nobody had told me about. Papers. Attorneys. Next week. I shook Ignacio's hand at the door. Firm. Warm. 2 seconds. I shook Lorraine's hand and told her it was a pleasure. I kissed Paloma on the cheek and told Declan I'd see him at the site tomorrow. I stood on the curb and watched their rental car pull out of the lot. Ignacio driving, Lorraine already talking. And I didn't move until the taillights turned the corner onto Main Street and disappeared. Then I walked to my truck. The Tacoma was 14 years old. The leather seats were cracked, and the heater took 3 minutes to kick in, and it smelled like sawdust and old thermoses. Which is to say, it smelled like every morning I'd had since Declan was in high school. I sat in the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel with both hands and stared straight through the windshield at the parking lot where Ignacio's rental had been. The stale taste of that conference room coffee was still on my tongue. Ignacio's cologne was still on my right hand from the handshake. The January cold was pressing against the window glass, and I could feel it through my sleeve where my arm rested against the door. Papers. Attorneys. I didn't know what they were building yet. But I knew one thing with the kind of certainty that settles into your bones and doesn't leave whatever it was. It wasn't a wedding gift. I sat in that truck for a long time. The engine idled. The heater finally kicked in. And somewhere in that silence, I made a decision I didn't have words for yet. I was 3 miles from home when I realized my office keys were still sitting on the conference table. Small, stupid mistake, the kind you make when your head is full of Spanish insults and your hands are gripping a steering wheel hard enough to leave marks. I turned the Tacoma around. The building was dark when I pulled back into the lot. One car left a silver rental I recognized as Ignacio's. I figured he'd stayed behind to make a call, maybe use the restroom. I wasn't thinking about anything except grabbing my keys and getting home to a kitchen where nobody was going to insult my craftsmanship in a language they assumed I couldn't speak. I took the stairs because the elevator makes noise. The hallway on the second floor smelled like stale coffee and cold concrete, and there was a strip of light under the conference room door. I reached for the handle, and then I heard his voice. Ignacio. On the phone. Speaking Spanish the way you speak when there's no audience, fast, loose, laughing. The father is so desperate for approval, it's pathetic, he said. He'll sign anything to keep his son happy. I told you he's predictable. I stopped with my hand an inch from the door. My keys were on the other side of it. So was the truth. No, he doesn't suspect a thing. Ignacio continued. I could hear him pacing. His shoes clicking on the floor I'd laid myself 12 years ago. He spent the whole meeting asking about my wine preferences. This is easier than the last one. There's a difference between being insulted and being hunted. One you can forgive over a drink. The other changes what you're willing to do next. I stood in that hallway and listened to a man laugh about me to someone I couldn't see. And something in my chest shifted from hot to cold so fast I could almost hear it click. Predictable. He called me predictable. Like my son's happiness was a line item on a spreadsheet. Like I was a lock he'd already picked. But it was the other part that changed everything. Easier than the last one. The last one. Which meant there was a last one. Which meant this wasn't improvisation, this was a system. A routine. Something they'd done before, to someone else's family. In some other city. With some other father who probably never saw it coming either. I pressed my back against the hallway wall and breathed through my nose and tasted something metallic at the back of my throat. Adrenaline or anger. I couldn't tell which. Every part of me wanted to walk through that door and ask him in his own language exactly what papers he was so eager to have ready. I wanted to watch his face when he realized the provincial builder with the calloused hands had understood every word he'd said since the moment he landed in this country. But here's the thing about being a father. If you blow up in an empty office over something your son can't even hear, you're just the jealous old man who ruined everything before it started. You're the controlling father who couldn't let go. You're the reason Declan stops returning your calls and Paloma stops kissing you on the cheek when she walks in. I've poured concrete foundations that took 3 days to cure. Revenge. I was learning. Takes longer, but it sets harder. Ignacio's voice went quiet. I heard the phone click off. Then his footsteps moving toward the back exit, the one that leads to the side lot. The door opened, closed. His car started. Headlights swept across the hallway window, and then he was gone. I waited 60 seconds. Then I walked into the dark conference room and picked my keys up off the table. They were right where I'd left them, next to the empty coffee cup, and the spot where Lorraine had stood that morning, tapping her nail against the glass case that held 4 months of my life. The keys bit into my palm when I squeezed them. I let them. I walked back to the Tacoma and sat behind the wheel for the second time that day. The parking lot was empty now. The building was dark. The January cold pressed against every window. Predictable. Easier than the last one. He'd given me 2 things without knowing it. A reason to dig and the patience to dig quietly. I didn't know yet what I'd find. I didn't know how deep it went, or how many families had the same story. But I knew I wasn't going to be the next one. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through contacts I hadn't touched in years, looking for a name I hadn't said out loud since Seville. How many years does a friendship have to sit dormant before you can call at midnight and ask a man to help you dismantle someone's life? I found the name in my phone between a plumber in Yonkers and a concrete supplier I hadn't used since 2019. Boyd Sinclair. No photo. No notes. Just dialed in close to 4 years. But I remembered the man behind it, the way you remember anyone who stood on scaffolding 3 stories up and trusted you with his weight. Boyd and I met on a job site outside Seville, back when we were both in our 20s. 2 Americans, neither one speaking enough Spanish to order lunch, both too stubborn to quit. We learned the language together, or rather, we got yelled at together until the language stuck. Boyd was the kind of man who read safety manuals for fun and remembered every regulation he'd ever seen. I was the kind who set rebar and framed walls and figured the manual could wait until something broke. Between us, nothing broke. After Spain, our lives forked. I came home to Westchester and started building houses. Boyd went into corporate risk consulting, the kind of work where companies pay you to find out what's wrong before it costs them everything. He was 55 now, still based in the city, still the calmest person in any room. We drifted the way men do when life fills in the spaces, but the friendship underneath hadn't gone anywhere. It was just waiting. I'm not a mastermind. I want to be clear about that. I'm a man who builds houses and knows when a foundation is crooked. The only smart thing I did that night was admit I couldn't fix this alone. I pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Frost was forming on the windshield, and the cab smelled like cold vinyl and old sawdust, and my mouth had gone completely dry. "Holbrook," Boyd said on the 3rd ring. His voice carried the same flat, unhurried calm it had 25 years ago on that scaffolding, when nothing rattled him and everything got done. "It's been years. Everything all right?" "No," I said. "I need a favor, and I need you to be very, very good at what you do." I told him everything. The conference room meeting, the Spanish I wasn't supposed to understand, Lorraine tapping her nail against the glass and calling my work garbage, the mention of legal papers and attorneys, and then the part that mattered most. Ignacio on the phone, laughing, saying I was predictable, saying this was easier than the previous time. "Easier than the last one," Boyd repeated. He didn't ask me to clarify. He didn't tell me I was overreacting. He went quiet for about 10 seconds, and I could hear him thinking that particular Boyd silence that meant he was already 3 steps ahead. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from knowing something terrible about your son's future and not being able to say a word about it. Sitting in that truck, talking to a voice I hadn't heard in years, I felt the loneliness crack just enough to let something else in. Not hope, it was too early for hope. Relief. The relief of not carrying it alone anymore. "The family name is Medina," I said. "Import business out of Barcelona. The father's name is Ignacio. He's got a company, I don't know how big, but he talks like a man with overhead." "Give me a few days," Boyd said. If it's what you think it is, this isn't just bad manners, Garrett. This is the kind of thing that has paperwork behind it. And paperwork always leaves a trail. How far can you go with this, as far as it goes? I've got contacts in Madrid from the consulting years. If the Medinas have a financial history in Spain, I'll find it. If they've done this before, there'll be a record. I thanked him. He told me not to thank him yet. I hung up and sat there in the cold cab, listening to the engine tick down. Metal contracting in the January air. The phone was still warm against my ear. The steering wheel was ice under my free hand. Boyd would dig. Boyd would find whatever was buried under the Medina family's polished surface. But while I waited, I had a different job ahead of me. The hardest role I'd ever play, starting tomorrow morning. I was going to invite the people who were trying to rob me to sleep under my own roof. I was going to smile and pour coffee and play the grateful father while Boyd worked in the dark. I turned the key and the Tacoma coughed to life. I had a guest house to prepare. I've built guest houses, garages, and a tree house that survived 2 hurricanes. But the hardest thing I ever constructed was the voice I used to call my son that morning and lie to him about why. The coffee was still percolating when I picked up the phone. January light came through the kitchen window, thin and cold, painting the counter in pale stripes. Across the frost-covered yard, the guest house sat exactly where I'd put it 19 years ago. Cedar siding I'd milled myself, a porch I'd framed in 3 weekends, a front door I'd hung while Declan handed me screws from a mason jar because the coffee can had finally rusted through. I stared at it through the glass and thought about what I was about to do. Declan picked up on the second ring. Hey, son. I was thinking, why don't Ignacio and Lorraine stay at the guest house for the rest of the week? Save them the drive back and forth from their hotel in the city. There was a pause. The kind that tells you someone is recalculating everything they thought they knew about you. Dad, are you sure? Declan said. I know yesterday was a lot. Meeting her parents for the first time. The whole partnership conversation. I wouldn't blame you if you needed some space. Declan, I want this family thing to work. Let me do this. His exhale came through the phone like a man setting down something heavy. That means a lot, Dad. Seriously. I'll tell Paloma she's going to be thrilled. I said goodbye and hung up, and stood there with the phone warm in my hand and the taste of black coffee bitter on my tongue. My son had just thanked me for being generous. What he didn't know was that I'd just positioned the enemy 40 yards from my bedroom window, inside walls I'd built myself, where every conversation in every language would carry through vents I'd installed with my own hands. Here's what nobody tells you about playing dumb. The performance isn't the hard part. The hard part is watching the people you love believe it. I poured another cup and cracked the kitchen window an inch. Cold January air cut through the coffee steam, and I breathed it in and let it sharpen me. The guest house had a living room, a bedroom, a kitchenette, and a bathroom with tiles I'd laid the same summer I designed the architectural model that Lorraine had tapped her nail against. Same summer, same hands, same man she called tasteless. I walked across the yard with fresh towels and a bag of groceries. I unlocked the guest house and stood inside it for a while, remembering Declan at 7, holding a coffee can full of nails, calling it helping. Declan at 12, sleeping on the guest house couch during a thunderstorm because he liked the sound of rain on a roof his father built. Declan at 29, bringing home a woman whose parents wanted to strip the foundation out from under all of it. I set the towels on the bathroom counter and the groceries in the kitchenette, and I checked every window, every vent, every sightline from the main house. I wasn't building a guest room anymore. I was building a listening post. A guest house is just a smaller version of your home. Same foundation, same bones, same hands that built it. Letting someone inside who wants to tear it down is the kind of irony that doesn't land until 3 in the morning, when you're staring at the ceiling wondering if you've lost your mind. Or finally found it. I spent the rest of the day doing normal things. I drove to the office. I reviewed 2 project bids. I ate lunch at my desk and didn't taste it. I checked my phone for a message from Boyd that didn't come yet because real investigations don't happen in an afternoon. I drove home and parked the Tacoma and sat in my kitchen and waited. They arrived at 6:30. I heard the car doors from the kitchen, 2 thumps, then the trunk. Through the window, I watched Ignacio carry a leather suitcase toward the guest house, while Lorraine adjusted her scarf against the cold. Paloma was walking ahead of them, pointing at the porch, laughing at something. Declan had his arm around her. My phone buzzed. A photo, Paloma and her parents pulling up with their luggage. The guest house glowing behind them in the porch light I'd wired myself. Dad, thank you for trying so hard with them. Declan wrote. It means everything to me. I read that message twice. I set the phone on the counter and wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and squeezed until the heat hurt. He has no idea what I heard. And when he finds out, it's going to change everything. But it's going to hurt a lot less than what they've got planned for him if don't. 5 days I watched the Medinas drink my coffee and sleep in my guest house and smile at my son like they meant it. 5 days of performing the grateful father while something cold ticked behind my ribs like a clock I couldn't turn off. On the 6th day, the first crack appeared. Faye Langley had been doing my books for 12 years. 5 years old, sharp as a box cutter. The kind of accountant who remembers invoice numbers the way other people remember birthdays. She was my senior accountant, and the only person in the company besides me who had access to every financial file we kept. In 12 years, she had never once knocked on my office door looking the way she looked that Wednesday morning, like someone who'd found a number that didn't want to be found. She closed the door behind her and set a printout on my desk. One line was highlighted in yellow. This transfer doesn't match anything in their filings, she said, her voice low enough that the hallway wouldn't hear it. It's routed through a holding company in Madrid that I can't find a registration for. I've been preparing the partnership files like you asked, and this showed up, buried in the 3rd appendix. I picked up the paper. The ink smelled like fresh toner, and the highlighted lines sat there on the page the way a crack sits in a foundation wall, small, quiet, and capable of bringing down the whole structure if you know what you're looking at. Don't tell anyone, I said. Not Declan, not the Medinas, nobody. Just keep recording everything you find. Faye looked at me for a long moment. How worried should I be? Worried enough to lock that file in your desk tonight. Numbers don't lie the way people do. They just sit there on a spreadsheet waiting for someone patient enough to read what they're actually saying. Faye was that kind of patient. She nodded once, took the printout back, and walked out of my office without another word. 12 years of loyalty doesn't need an explanation. It just needs a locked drawer. 2 evenings later, I parked the Tacoma at the far edge of my driveway, away from the guest house, and called Boyd. I could see the guest house windows glowing gold through the bare January trees. Inside, Ignacio and Lorraine were probably finishing dinner on plates I'd bought and a table I'd built. Boyd picked up on the first ring this time. I've got preliminary results, he said. No greeting, no small talk. That was Boyd when the numbers were bad. He skipped the warmth. The import company was restructured 2 years ago. On paper, it looks like a reorganization. In practice, it's a shell. The operating revenue dried up 18 months ago, and they've been running on credit lines secured against family properties in Seville. How much? 6 to 8 million in debt. Real numbers, the kind that don't get fixed by selling a wine cellar. $6 to $8 million. That's not a family in trouble. That's a family in free fall, and they were reaching for my ledge on the way down. I gripped the steering wheel with my free hand. The cold from the window seeped through my jacket sleeve, and I let it. My mouth had gone dry the way it does when numbers start confirming what your gut already knew. Boyd, my accountant, found something too. A wire transfer routed through an unregistered holding company in Madrid, buried in the partnership documents they gave us. Boyd went quiet. I could hear road noise on his end. He was driving, probably coming back from a client in the city. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped half a register. That tracks. The holding company is likely theirs, structured to obscure the debt trail. Garrett, the deal they're building for you isn't an investment. It's a lifeline. They need your assets to collateralize their European obligations. My assets, I said. The words tasted like metal. Your commercial land portfolio, the I-287 corridor properties. That's what this is about. They need something solid enough to pledge against the Spanish creditors. And there's more about what they're about to propose to you. He paused. You're going to want to be sitting down for this part. I'm in my truck. Good enough. I sat there with the phone pressed hard against my ear, staring at the guest house across my yard. Warm light in every window. A shell company held together with paperwork and pride. Millions in debt I was never supposed to find out about. And something worse still coming. Something about the deal they were building that made Boyd Sinclair. A man who'd spent 3 decades staring at ugly numbers without flinching. Tell me to sit down. That weekend I grilled a rack of ribs for a man who was trying to steal everything I owned, and still managed to ask him how he liked the sauce. Boyd would call back with the rest of it, the part he'd told me to sit down for but that came after. I'll get to that. But first I had a cookout to host. Because the best surveillance in the world is a Saturday afternoon with cold beer and hickory smoke, and a man who thinks you're too simple to be dangerous. I fired up the offset smoker at 7 in the morning, while frost was still on the grass. By noon, the backyard smelled like charred fat and wood smoke and January cold. And by 2 o'clock, both families were gathered around the picnic table like something out of a magazine spread. Declan had brought cornbread. Paloma made a salad with pomegranate seeds. Ignacio arrived in a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my smoker. And Lorraine wore a scarf that she adjusted every time the wind shifted, which was often. I played the part. I asked Ignacio about Seville. I let him tell me my ribs needed 12 hours of marination. I nodded when he explained the difference between Spanish oak and American hickory like he was teaching a child to tie his shoes. In Spain, we would marinate overnight at least 12 hours,
he said, peering at the grate with the expression of a man inspecting someone else's homework.
This is enthusiastic, but rushed. I'll have to try that sometime, I said. You'll have to show me before you head home. He smiled. Lorraine smiled. And then Lorraine leaned toward Ignacio and said in Spanish, quiet enough for just the two of them, and loud enough for the man she didn't know was listening. He really does try so hard. Like a dog that keeps bringing you the wrong stick. Underestimation has a taste. It tastes like standing over your own smoker while a woman compares you to a lost dog in a language she thinks is a locked room, and you just keep turning the ribs. You smile. You baste. You let the hickory smoke curl into your eyes until they water, and nobody can tell the difference between smoke tears and the other kind. Declan and Paloma were at the far end of the table, sharing cornbread and laughing about something on his phone. They looked happy, genuinely, unguardedly happy, and watching them hurt in a way I couldn't explain to anyone who hasn't had to protect someone from a truth that would break them. I kept cooking. I kept smiling. I kept cataloging. Late in the afternoon, when the beer had slowed everyone down, and Lorraine was inside using the bathroom, Ignacio's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, stood from the picnic table, and walked toward the back fence, away from the group. He answered in Spanish, rapidly, businesslike. Nothing like the warm patriarch who'd been critiquing my ribs an hour earlier. I picked up 2 beers from the cooler and started walking toward him. Slowly. The way you approach a deer you don't want to spook. How many times can a man say deadline into a phone before the person standing 6 feet away with a cold beer and a warm smile starts to wonder what exactly is running out of time? The deadline is tighter than we thought, Ignacio said into the phone, his back still turned. We may need to accelerate. I'll handle the American. Handle the American. like I was a task on a checklist. My boots crunched on the frozen grass, and Ignacio turned. The shift was instant. Shoulders relaxed, jaw softened, phone dropping to his side. He ended the call with a quick, "Te llamo luego," and faced me with a smile that arrived half a second too late. "Everything all right?" I said, holding out the beer. "Looked like an important call." "Just business back home," he said. "Never stops, even on vacation." He took the bottle and clinked it against mine. "Thank you. This beer is perfect." I smiled. I clinked. I took a sip of beer I could barely taste and filed the word away like a nail in a coffee can. Plazo. Deadline. He had one, and it was getting shorter. And whatever was on the other end of it involved handling me. I walked back to the smoker with that word ringing in my head like a bell struck in an empty church. People with deadlines make mistakes. And I was going to be standing right there, cold beer in hand, smoke in my eyes, smiling like the fool they needed me to be when Ignacio Medina made his next one. 2 days after the cookout, Ignacio Medina walked into my conference room carrying a leather folder and the kind of smile that a man wears when he's about to sell you something you didn't ask for. I'd been waiting for this. Boyd's call after the cookout had laid it out. The deal would be structured as a joint investment partnership. Designed to look like estate planning, but built to siphon my assets into collateral for their European obligations. I knew what was coming. I just didn't know how pretty they'd make it sound. Ignacio set the leather folder on the table and unclasped it with both hands, the way a jeweler opens a case. Lorraine sat beside him, ankles crossed, hands folded. The picture of supportive family matriarch. The conference room smelled like his cologne layered over the permanent sawdust undertone that no amount of cleaning had ever removed from these walls. I held a cup of coffee I had no intention of drinking, just a prop. Something to do with my hands while I listened. In Europe, family wealth is consolidated across generations, Ignacio began, sliding a summary document across the table with manicured fingers. We are preparing a joint investment partnership, something to protect Declan and Paloma long-term. We'd like to review it with you before the wedding. Family to family, Lorraine added, her voice warm as bathwater. It's how we protect our children. Protect. That word again. Every con artist I've ever met on a job site used that word right before they asked you to sign something. Protect your investment. Protect your timeline. Protect your family. It's the word people reach for when they want you to stop thinking and start trusting. I've had men try to lowball me on a contract with a handshake and a compliment about my truck. I know what a hustle looks like when it's wearing a good suit. Ignacio walked me through the summary, page by page. Cross-border synergy, consolidated family wealth, tax-efficient structuring across jurisdictions. He used phrases that floated above the table like smoke, impressive, vague, designed to make a man who builds houses feel like he was sitting at the wrong table. Lorraine nodded at each point, as if she were hearing it for the first time. Which she wasn't, because they'd rehearsed this the way you rehearse closing arguments. I let him talk. I let Lorraine add her gentle touches, a hand on my arm here, "this is so exciting," there. I watched Ignacio's hands as he spoke, the way they moved with practiced ease across the documents. And I thought about Boyd's voice on the phone telling me exactly what this partnership was designed to do. Then I scratched my jaw. I furrowed my brow at the legal language. I tilted the summary page toward the window like a man trying to read a menu without his glasses. And I delivered the best performance of my life. I build houses. Ignacio, I said slowly, shaking my head at the document. I don't know much about fancy partnerships. But this sounds real generous. Why don't you have your people send the full draft directly to me? I'll look it over myself. Acting dumb is a lot like setting a foundation. The longer you hold steady without anyone noticing, the stronger the thing you're building on top of it. Ignacio's eyes changed. Not much, just enough. A flicker behind the warmth, a settling. The look of a man who just heard the answer he'd been waiting for. He thought I'd swallowed it whole. "Of course," he said. "We'll have the complete draft to you by end of week. Very straightforward, I assure you." Lorraine touched my arm again. "So generous of you to consider this. Garrett, the children will be so pleased." I watched that glint settle into Ignacio's eyes. The same look a foreman gets when an inspector signs off on something he shouldn't have. Crime dressed up as gratitude. The con artist's favorite disguise. I walked them to the door. I shook Ignacio's hand the way you shake a man's hand when you want him to feel safe. Firm. Warm. 2 seconds. Eye contact. Lorraine kissed both my cheeks. I stood on the curb and watched their rental disappear down the block. And I held that coffee cup I'd never sipped and felt the January cold press through my jacket. The draft would arrive by Friday. And when it did, I wasn't going to read it alone. I was going to hand it to the one man who could tell me, in plain English, exactly how much of my life they were trying to take. His job for the last 30 years had been tearing contracts apart the way I tear down walls, stud by stud, until every hidden thing is standing in the open. The contract arrived Friday afternoon by courier, 18 pages in a cream envelope with Ignacio's name embossed on the return address. I waited until the house was quiet and the guest house lights were off before I took it into my study. I can read a blueprint upside down in the rain. I can frame a 2-story wall by myself if I have to. But I sat at my desk that night, under a single lamp, with those 18 pages spread out in front of me, and I couldn't understand a single one of them. Irrevocable beneficial interest transfer. I read it 5 times, and it still sounded like someone had put English words in a blender and poured them onto expensive paper. Cross-jurisdictional collateral assignment. Subordinated security interest with perfected lien priority. Every sentence led to another sentence that led to a clause that referenced an appendix that circled back to a definition on page 2 that I'd already read 3 times without grasping. I picked up a pen and tried to underline the parts I didn't understand. After 10 minutes, the pages were more ink than white space. 22 years of running my own company. My own contracts, my own negotiations, my own bad breaks handled at my own desk with my own pen. There's a pride in that, a stubbornness, and it doesn't like admitting when it's swimming past its depth. I'd built a conference room with my hands and run a business from it that employed 26 people. And this document from a man who mocked my pronunciation made me feel exactly like the dumb contractor they believed I was. The clock on the wall ticked loud enough to hear between paragraphs. The study smelled like old wood and leather, and the cold coffee I'd poured an hour ago and forgotten to drink. I turned to page 7 and read the same paragraph for the 4th time and felt something crack. Not anger, not fear. Something quieter. The recognition that pride is a luxury when your son's future is written in a language you can't decode. They don't put this on motivational posters. But the bravest thing a man can do isn't fight. It's pick up the phone and admit he doesn't understand what he's looking at. I looked at my phone. I looked at the clock. 10 at night. I thought about waiting until morning and doing this properly. Making an appointment. Sitting in a leather chair across from a mahogany desk. Then I thought about Declan. I thought about him signing something like this one day with a smile on his face, thinking it was a gift from his in-laws. That's what made me dial. Leland Prescott picked up on the second ring. 58 years old. The kind of attorney who wore reading glasses on a chain and never raised his voice because he never had to. He'd been my lawyer for 15 years. Every land acquisition, every construction dispute, every contract I'd ever signed that mattered. He answered the way he always did. "Holbrook, calling after 9. This can't be good. What's going on?" "Leland, I need you to listen to something." I picked up the contract and read him 3 lines from the guarantee clause on page 14. I read them slowly. The way you read a warning label when you finally realize it applies to you. The phone went quiet. Not the polite quiet of a man waiting his turn. The heavy quiet, the kind that pushes against your ear and tells you something before the words do. I could hear him breathing. I could hear the faint creak of what I imagined was his desk chair leaning back. "Read that again," he said. I read it again. The silence this time was longer. When Leland spoke, his voice had dropped into a register I'd only heard twice in 15 years. Both times involving someone trying to commit fraud on a property deal. Flat. Dead. The voice of a man who has stopped being your friend and started being your attorney. "Garrett, don't sign this. Don't sign anything. Don't discuss it with anyone. I'm coming to your office first thing tomorrow morning." How bad is it? I need to read the whole document before I answer that. But what you just read me, those 3 lines, that's not a partnership clause. That's a trapdoor. I hung up and sat there in the quiet of my study with the contract fanned across my desk like evidence at a crime scene. The pages were rough under my fingertips and covered in my pen marks. The marks of a man trying to teach himself a language he didn't speak. Leland Prescott had seen bad contracts and shady deals and blown deadlines for 3 decades. I'd never once heard him sound the way he sounded tonight. Like a man who just read the opening lines of something that was going to get much worse by the last page. Leland Prescott arrived at my office at 7:45 the next morning, 15 minutes before I even unlocked the front door. And that alone told me everything I needed to know about how bad it was. He was standing by the entrance with his briefcase in one hand and a legal pad in the other. Reading glasses already on. No coffee, no small talk. I unlocked the door and he walked past me toward the conference room without a word. By the time I got there, he had the contract spread across the table and a red pen uncapped. "Sit down," he said. "This is going to take a while." He started on page 1 and worked forward. Every clause he stopped at, he translated into plain English, the kind of English a man who builds houses can understand. And every translation landed harder than the last. "This clause here," he said, tapping a paragraph on page 3. "Beneficial interest transfer. In carpenter terms, it means you hand over the deed and someone else decides whether you ever see it again." I leaned forward. "And this one cross-jurisdictional collateral assignment?" Leland looked at me over his reading glasses. "That means if something goes wrong on their end in Spain, in a court you've never heard of, they can put a lien on your land before you even get a phone call. Your properties become collateral for debts that aren't yours. Governed by laws you've never read, in a language they assume you don't speak." The red pen moved down the page. Mark after mark after mark. By page 6, the contract looked like it was bleeding. Watching Leland read that document was like watching a building inspector walk through a house you thought was solid and start tapping walls that sound hollow. You don't want to hear it. You don't want to see the look on his face when he finds another soft spot. But you stand there and you listen because the alternative is living inside something that's going to come down on your head. He moved through pages 7 through 12 in near silence, making notes on his legal pad in handwriting so precise it looked printed. Occasionally, he'd stop, reread a clause, and draw a small box around it with the red pen. I counted the boxes. By page 12, there were 9. "What are the boxes?" I asked. "Clauses that benefit only one party," he said without looking up. "Yours is not that party." The morning light moved across the conference table while we worked. Neither of us touched the coffee I'd poured. My stomach wouldn't have accepted it anyway. The contract pages felt heavy every time Leland passed one back to me, heavier than paper has any right to feel when you understand what the words on it are designed to do. There's a particular kind of helplessness that comes from watching an expert confirm that the thing you were afraid of is real. And then he tells you he needs more time before he can tell you just how real. Leland reached page 14 and stopped. He read the same section 3 times. He took his glasses off, cleaned them on his tie, put them back on, and read it again. Then he set his pen down. Not the way I'd set mine down 2 weeks ago at this same table, but the way a surgeon sets down an instrument when he's found something he wasn't expecting. "Garrett, I've been doing this for 30 years, he said. His voice had gone flat again, that dead register from the phone call. Standard partnership agreements don't look like this. There are offshore routing provisions in the guarantee structure that I need to cross-reference with a specialist. Give me until the weekend. How bad are we talking? Leland, give it to me straight. He looked at me. Not at the contract. Not at his notes, at me. The way a doctor looks at you when he's deciding how much to say. I'm not ready to give you the full picture yet, but I can tell you this much. There's something fundamentally wrong with how they've structured the asset guarantee, and I don't think it's an accident. Not an accident. 3 words that turned suspicion into something with weight and edges. Leland packed the contract into his briefcase with careful deliberation, the leather clasps clicking shut like a verdict. I'll have the full picture by the weekend. Until then, don't sign. Don't promise. And don't let them know you've shown this to anyone. I watched him drive away and stood in the empty parking lot with the January cold pressing through my jacket. 30 years of contracts, and he'd never seen one built like this. Neither had I. But then again, I build things that are meant to stand up. Whatever was in those pages was designed to do the opposite, while Leland worked through the contract that weekend. Faye kept digging. 2 days after he left my office with that briefcase full of red pen marks, she called me into hers and closed the door behind me. In 12 years? Faye Langley had never once closed that door. She worked with it open the way I work with my truck windows down habit. Temperament. A preference for air moving through. When I heard the latch click, my stomach dropped. Before she said a word, printouts covered her desk. Not the neat stacks Faye usually kept. These were spread out like a hand of cards. Highlighted in yellow, edges curling from the printer heat. The machine in the corner was still humming. The office smelled like warm toner and filing cabinets, and something else. The particular tension of a person who's found what she was looking for and wishes she hadn't. I followed the Madrid holding company backward through their corporate filings, she said, standing behind her desk with her arms crossed. 3 years ago, Ignacio's company proposed an identical partnership to a construction firm in Valencia. Same structure, same clauses, same offshore routing. She slid a printout across the desk. I picked it up. The paper was warm in my hands. What happened to them? Faye looked at me, the way she looks at a ledger that doesn't balance steady. Certain. Already past the part where surprise is useful. They signed. 18 months later, they filed for bankruptcy. The holding company seized their assets before they even knew what hit them. 3 years ago, a family in Valencia signed a piece of paper that looked exactly like the one sitting on my desk at home. They trusted the same handshake. They believed the same pitch about consolidating family wealth and protecting the children. And they lost everything they'd ever built. I sat down in the chair across from Faye's desk and held that printout and let the words settle the way concrete settles slowly. Permanently. Impossible to undo once it's set. The contract language is almost identical. Faye continued. She pulled another sheet from the stack and laid it beside the first. I ran a comparison. The partnership structure. The guarantee clauses. The beneficial interest provisions, they've refined some of the wording. But the architecture is the same. This isn't their first time. Not their first time. The phrase connected to something I'd heard weeks ago, standing in a dark hallway outside my own conference room. Easier than the last one. Ignacio hadn't been bragging on that phone call. He'd been comparing notes with himself, grading his own performance against a family he'd already destroyed. I thought about that family in Spain. I thought about someone else's father sitting in someone else's study, reading someone else's version of this contract, trying the same warm smile I'd been watching across my kitchen table for 2 weeks. He signed. He probably shook Ignacio's hand afterward. He probably thought he was protecting his children. I thought about what happened 18 months later when the holding company came for everything and there was nothing left to protect. So another family wasn't as lucky as me, I said. Faye was quiet for a moment. The printer stopped humming. The office went still. No, she said. They weren't. And Garrett, the contract you're holding right now, it's almost word for word identical to the one that buried them. The taste of bile rose at the back of my throat. Not metaphor, the real thing. The physical taste of realizing that the people sleeping in my guest house, eating my food, kissing my son's fiancée on the cheek, had done this to someone else's family and walked away clean enough to do it again. I gripped the printout until the paper creased under my fingers. Faye didn't tell me to be careful with it. She understood. "How far back does the trail go?" I asked. "I don't know yet. Boyd's contacts in Madrid might be able to pull older records. But what I have here is enough to prove a pattern. Same entity, same structure, same result." I stood up. I folded the printout and put it in my jacket pocket. I thanked Faye without finding the right words for what I was thanking her for, which was more than research, more than overtime, more than diligence. She'd given me proof that this wasn't personal. It was professional. The Medinas didn't hate me. They didn't even see me. I was just the next name on a list. I walked out of her office and stood in the hallway with the printout warm against my chest, and thought about a man in Valencia who never had a Faye Langley staying late to pull old records. Who never had a Boyd Sinclair digging through shell companies? Who had nothing but a smile and a pen and Ignacio Medina telling him it was all for the family. The question I'd been dreading didn't come from a lawyer or an accountant. It came from my own son. Standing in my living room that evening with a beer he wasn't really drinking, ping at the label the way he used to pick at his shoelaces when he was 9 and something at school didn't add up. I'd just come home from Faye's office with the Valencia printout still folded in my jacket pocket. The fireplace was going. The guest house across the yard was dark. The Medinas had gone into the city for dinner with Paloma. Declan had stayed behind, and I could tell from the way he was standing that he'd been waiting for me. "Dad, can I ask you something?" I set my keys on the counter. "Always." He took a sip of the beer he wasn't tasting. "Paloma said something weird the other day about how important it is that this deal works out for her family. Like, more important than it should be? Not worried exactly, just..." He trailed off, looked at me. "Dad, do you think her family is a little off?" The lie I told him tasted sour before it even left my mouth. "Every family's got their quirks, son. Give them time." He nodded. He wanted to believe me. That's the thing about trust between a father and a son. It doesn't ask for evidence. It just leans forward and accepts what you hand it. I put my hand on his shoulder. Brief, reassuring, dishonest. He squeezed the beer bottle and changed the subject to a project timeline at work. And we talked about load-bearing walls for 10 minutes while the fire cracked and popped. And the lie sat between us like a stone neither of us could see. Nobody warns you about this part of being a father. Sometimes protecting your kid means lying to his face and hoping he forgives you for it when the truth finally comes out. After Declan went upstairs, I sat alone in my study with the door closed and the fireplace smell still in my clothes. I thought about telling him everything. I thought about pulling out Faye's printout and Boyd's findings and laying it all on the kitchen table and watching my son's face change, the way faces change when the person you love turns out to be attached to people who don't love you back. But I couldn't. Not yet. If I told him now without airtight proof, without the full picture, Leland was building I was just the jealous old man who torpedoed his son's happiness on a hunch. The controlling father who couldn't let go. The reason Declan stops returning calls and Paloma stops kissing me on the cheek. Not enough yet. Let them put the noose around their own necks. Then pull. The next morning I brought Leland and Faye together in the conference room for the first time. 3 folders hit the table, Boyd's findings in a blue binder, Faye's records in a manila envelope, Leland's contract notes in his leather portfolio. 3 separate threads that had been running in parallel for 2 weeks, finally laid side by side under the same fluorescent lights. Building a case is a lot like building a house. You don't hang the drywall until the framing is inspected. And you don't confront a man until every nail in the evidence is driven flush. This is everything we have, I said. Boyd's shell company findings, Faye's prior fraud records, your contract analysis. I need the full picture. What exactly are they trying to do to me, and can I prove it? Leland tapped his pen once on the table, a habit he had when he was about to commit to something. Give me until the weekend. By Saturday morning, I'll tell you exactly what they're building and exactly how to stop it. Faye straightened her stack. I'll have the Valencia paper trail completed by Friday, every transaction, every entity, every date. The conference room door clicked shut behind them when they left, and I stood alone at the table, looking at the space where 3 folders had been. 3 people. 4 days. A line that felt less like a timeline and more like a fuse. I walked out of that room with something I hadn't had since the day I overheard Lorraine call my work garbage a shape. Not just suspicion. Not just anger. Not just scattered evidence pulling in different directions. A shape. The outline of something I could build on. The way I build on anything, one piece at a time. Measured twice, nailed once. Saturday. Leland would have the anatomy of the contract. Faye would have the fraud trail locked down. And I would have the answer to the only question that mattered. Not whether the Medinas were trying to rob me, but exactly how much rope to give them before I pulled it tight. Saturday came the way deadlines always come. Too fast and too quiet. Leland walked into my office at 8 in the morning, carrying a folder thick enough to prop open a door, and the look on his face told me it was heavy in ways that had nothing to do with paper. The office was empty. No crew, no phones ringing, no sawdust in the air, just floor polish and cold coffee. And 2 men sitting at a conference table that suddenly felt too large for the conversation we were about to have. Leland opened the folder and spread the contents across the table the way a doctor spreads x-rays when the news isn't good. Annotated contract pages, cross-referenced corporate filings, a timeline chart with arrows connecting dates and entities in red ink. Faye's Valencia records laid alongside the current contract, with matching clauses highlighted in yellow. It looked like the evidence wall in a crime documentary, except it was my life pinned to that table. Let me walk you through what we're looking at, Leland said. He put his reading glasses on and picked up the first page. The guarantee structure only flows one way, from your assets to their creditors. There's no reciprocal protection if their company defaults. And based on Boyd's numbers, it will. Spanish lenders can seize your commercial properties without a single hearing in a U.S. court. I took a sip of coffee. Bitter. Black needed. How is that even legal? It's legal because of how they've structured the jurisdictional provisions. The contract designates a Spanish arbitration forum with binding authority. You'd be consenting to foreign jurisdiction over American assets. Once signed, any challenge you filed in a U.S. court would be stayed pending the Spanish arbitration, which their attorneys would control. No reciprocal protection, no U.S. court hearing, no appeal. They'd built a contract the way you'd build a trapdoor designed to open in only one direction, with no way back up. Leland moved through the pages methodically, his pen stopping at each red-marked clause. The collateral provisions triggered automatically on default, no notice required. The offshore routing created a jurisdictional shield between Ignacio's failing company and any American regulatory body. Every mechanism was one-directional. Every safeguard protected only one side. And page 14? I asked. Leland took his glasses off and cleaned them on his tie, the same gesture he'd made the first time he read it. That's the part I need one more night to verify. There's a clause that references a bilateral enforcement treaty between Spain and the United States. If it says what I think it says, this isn't just aggressive. It's designed to be irreversible. Once you sign, there's no mechanism to unwind it from the American side. Irreversible. That word sat in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. I thought about what would have happened if Faye hadn't knocked on my door that Wednesday. If Boyd had been unreachable, if I'd been too proud to call Leland at 10 o'clock at night, I would have signed this contract. I would have shaken Ignacio's hand and thanked him for the opportunity. I would have signed it smiling. The way the family in Valencia signed theirs, grateful and blind and gone within 18 months. Leland packed up carefully, squaring the pages, closing the folder with the same deliberation he brought to everything. "I need to read page 14 one more time tonight with fresh eyes," he said. "Tomorrow morning, I'll give you the certain answer. And Garrett, when I do, you're going to want to have a plan ready." He left. The conference room door closed behind him with a click that echoed off the empty walls. I sat there alone at the table, looking at the coffee ring his mug had left on the wood and thinking about one word: irreversible. They hadn't just written a bad deal. They'd written a lock with no key on my side of the door. 22 years of work. Every house. Every contract. Every early morning and late night and nail driven into wood that I'd measured and cut myself. All of it hanging on one clause on page 14 that a 58-year-old lawyer needed one more night to decode. I locked up the office and drove home slow. The way I always do when my head's too full to trust myself at a yellow light. The guest house was lit up when I pulled into the driveway. Through the curtains I could see shadows moving Ignacio. Lorraine, probably pouring themselves a glass of my wine, toasting to a Saturday well spent. They had no idea that a man in reading glasses was sitting in his study right now, working through page 14 line by line. And by tomorrow morning, that page was going to become the most important page of Ignacio Medina's life. I haven't lost a night's sleep over money since I was 24 and living out of my truck. But this wasn't about money anymore. And the guest house lights were still on at 2 in the morning. I stood at my bedroom window in the dark, watching the glow through the bare trees. Same windows I'd framed, same porch light I'd wired. 2 people behind those walls who had crossed an ocean to take what I'd spent my life building. And they were still awake at 2 in the morning, which meant they were either celebrating or planning. And neither option let me close my eyes. I thought about the family in Valencia. Did they have a night like this, lying in the dark, sensing something crooked in the foundation, but not able to name it? Or did they just sign and smile and not find out until the walls came down around them? I'd never... No. But I knew this: they didn't have a Leland Prescott working through page 14 by lamplight. They didn't have anyone watching the lights at 2 in the morning. At 4, the guest house went dark. At 5, I gave up on sleep and went downstairs and made coffee too strong because I didn't care about the ratio. The kitchen smelled like a man who'd been awake since yesterday, and the February cold pressed against every window like it wanted in. I stood in my own kitchen pouring coffee for someone who was planning to take my house out from under me. And I smiled while I did it. That's where I was when the guest house door opened at 7:15 and Ignacio walked across the frost-covered yard in a sweater that cost more than my coffee maker. Lorraine 2 steps behind him, adjusting her scarf. I had bacon going, I had eggs, I had toast and orange juice and the kind of breakfast spread that a generous host puts out for honored guests. And every piece of it was a lie wrapped in butter. "You're up early," Ignacio said, settling into a kitchen chair like he'd been sitting there his whole life. "Trouble sleeping?" "Just excited about the week ahead," I said. "More coffee," he accepted with the smile of a man who believed every word. Lorraine sat beside him and wrapped her hands around the mug I'd poured and leaned toward Ignacio and said something in Spanish that hit me like a fist I couldn't flinch from. Look at him, so relaxed. He has no idea what's coming. This will be the easiest one yet. The easiest one yet. She said it the way you'd describe a recipe you've made so many times you don't need the card anymore. Not easier than the last one that was Ignacio's version. Weeks ago, on the phone. This was Lorraine's. The easiest one yet, like they kept score. Like they ranked their victims by difficulty, and I was setting a new low. I flipped the bacon. I smiled. I poured more coffee. The cast iron was hot enough to spit grease across the back of my hand, and I let it sting because the pain kept my face steady. Lorraine laughed at something Ignacio said about the cold weather. I laughed too. We all laughed together in my kitchen on a Sunday morning like a family. And the only person in the room who knew it was a funeral rehearsal was the one holding the spatula. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't reach for it. Not yet. I slid the bacon onto a plate and set it on the table, and wiped my hands on a dish towel, and then, casually, like a man checking the time, I pulled the phone halfway out. Leland's name. 6 words on the screen. Call me the second you're alone. The phone was hot against my thigh when I slid it back. Leland didn't text. Leland called. Or he waited. Or he wrote letters on firm letterhead. He didn't text 6 urgent words at 7:30 on a Sunday morning, unless something on page 14 had kept him up all night too. I set the coffee pot down. I need to check something in the garage, I said. Car's been making a noise. Back in 5. Ignacio waved his mug. Take your time. We're not going anywhere. No, they weren't. That was the whole problem. I walked across the kitchen with my phone burning through my jeans and the taste of too strong coffee sitting on my tongue like a warning. I pulled the garage door shut behind me and leaned against the cold metal flank of my old Tacoma, and the air smelled like motor oil and frozen concrete, and I dialed Leland's number with hands that hadn't shaken once in 22 years of holding a nail gun. He picked up before the first ring finished. Leland didn't say hello. He said, "Garrett, sit down." And in 15 years of working together, he had never once told me to sit down. I was already leaning against the Tacoma in the cold garage, the metal biting through my jacket. The smell of motor oil and frozen concrete filled my lungs. Through the gap under the garage door, I could hear Lorraine laughing in the kitchen, the distant, casual laugh of a woman eating my food and planning my ruin. "I'm sitting," I lied. "Page 14, Leland said. His voice was flat, clinical, the voice he used when feelings would only slow things down. "The bilateral enforcement treaty is real. The clause is valid, and it does exactly what I was afraid it would do." He laid it out. Every word precise, every sentence built the way I build walls, load-bearing first, finish work after. "They've structured this so your commercial property acts as the primary loan guarantor for Ignacio's European entity. If his company defaults, and based on everything Boyd and Fay have found, it will default within months. The offshore lenders have an immediate, unappealable lien against your land. No U.S. court hearing, no notice period, no appeal. You aren't giving Declan a business partner. You're signing a confession that makes your life's work pay off their foreign debts." My mouth went dry. The complete, bone-deep dry that comes when the last piece of something terrible clicks into place. "Explain that in carpenter terms." "Leland, you hand them the deed. They hand it to a bank in Madrid. The bank calls in the loan. You lose everything along the I-287 corridor before you even get a phone call. That's what page 14 says. $18 million. Say it slow. That's 22 years of waking up before dawn. 22 years of bad weather and good lumber and contracts signed on the hood of a truck. Every nail, every handshake, every house I'd ever built, reduced to a line item in someone else's bailout. And the Valencia family, I said. Same structure, same treaty clause, same result. They signed in good faith and lost everything within 18 months. The holding company seized their assets through the Spanish arbitration forum, exactly the mechanism embedded in your contract. This isn't a template they downloaded. Garrett, this was custom built for exactly this purpose. They've refined it, they've tested it, and they brought it to your conference table in a leather folder with a smile. I stared at the garage wall. My tools hung motionless on their hooks. Levels, tape measures, a framing square I'd owned since I was 23. Everything in its place. Everything where I'd put it. And 40 yards away, 2 people were eating my breakfast, and planning to take every piece of property those tools had ever helped me build. I didn't feel angry anymore. Not the hot kind. What settled into me in that cold garage was steadier than anger, the kind of quiet that comes when you finally see the whole board and realize you've been playing a game you didn't know had started. "What do I do?" I asked. "You don't sign, obviously. But more than that, you need to decide whether you want to simply walk away from this deal, or whether you want to make sure they can't do it to the next family." "The next family," I repeated. "There will be one. There always is, with people like this." I thought about Declan. I thought about him at that first meeting, pulling out Paloma's chair with easy affection, looking at me like I was the one who needed to prove himself worthy of this union. He had no idea he was the bait. The Medinas hadn't come to welcome me into their family. They'd come because I own what they need. My son's wedding wasn't a celebration to them, it was a closing date. They weren't marrying into my family, they were buying it. And they were going to use my own boy's love to seal the transaction. "I'll call you back," I said. "Garrett, don't do anything yet. We need a plan." "I know. I'll call you back." I hung up and sat in that truck for a long time. My breath fogged the cold windshield. Cleared, fogged again. The phone screen dimmed in my hand. Through the garage wall, I could hear the muffled sounds of breakfast continuing without me. Silverware, voices, the ordinary sounds of a Sunday morning in a house where nothing was ordinary anymore. They thought the hardest part was behind them. They thought all that was left was paperwork and a handshake and a grateful fool signing away his future. They had no idea I was the paperwork now. I walked back into that kitchen and poured Ignacio Medina another cup of my coffee. I already knew exactly what I was going to do. I just hadn't decided when. I decided when the next morning. I decided the moment I stepped onto my back porch and found Ignacio Medina already sitting there with 2 mugs of coffee he'd brewed himself, using my kitchen like he owned it. He was in a pressed shirt and slacks at 6:30 in the morning, legs crossed, watching the frost melt off my yard with the patience of a man who'd done this before and knew exactly how the next conversation was supposed to go. The second mug was waiting for me on the railing. He'd found the good coffee, the dark roast I keep behind the regular stuff. "I hope you don't mind," he said, lifting his mug. "Your kitchen is very well stocked. You're up early, when something matters. I don't like to waste daylight." He wanted to talk about the partnership. Of course he did. His deadline was tightening. I could see it in the way his foot bounced against the porch rail. The only part of him that wasn't perfectly controlled. He steered the conversation toward finalizing the details. The timeline. Getting things on paper before the families get too busy with wedding preparations. Every sentence was designed to sound casual, and every sentence had a hook in it. "Now let me tell you something about a man who helps himself to your kitchen at 6 in the morning. He's not being friendly. He's measuring the countertops." I let him talk. I sipped the coffee he'd made, with my beans in my pot in my house, and I nodded the way I'd been nodding for 3 weeks, slow, grateful, a little overwhelmed by the sophistication of it all. I asked a question about European tax structure that I already knew the answer to, just to watch him light up at the chance to explain something to the simple builder. Then I set my mug down on the railing and scratched the back of my neck and said the thing I'd been rehearsing since the garage. "Ignacio, I've been thinking about this partnership, and I want to do it right." He straightened. The foot stopped bouncing. I talked to my lawyer, and I told him I want a clean, simple contract. Nothing too complicated, something the whole family can feel good about. I paused. Let it breathe. And I was thinking, why do this behind closed doors? Let's sign at the celebration party. In front of the kids, in front of everyone. Make it mean something. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Ignacio's face opened like a man who's just been told he won the lottery and is trying to act surprised. "A signing before the whole family," he said. Very meaningful indeed." The back door opened and Lorraine stepped out, scarf already on. Drawn by the sound of something going her way. She must have been listening from the kitchen. "Oh, that's beautiful," she said, clasping her hands together. "The children will remember that moment forever." "Yes, they will. Just not the way you think." I watched her face the genuine delight, the poorly concealed relief, the way her eyes flicked to Ignacio with a look that said everything their Spanish asides had been saying for weeks. They thought the fool was handing them victory on a silver platter. They thought the hardest part, the charming, the flattering, the patient maneuvering was over. All that was left was a signature and a handshake and a grateful idiot who'd never know what he'd given away until it was too late. There's a kind of handshake that means business, and a kind that means family, and a kind that means a man just handed you the shovel to dig his own grave. When Ignacio stood and extended his hand, it was the third kind. "Partners, then," he said, "and family." His grip was strong, confident, the grip of a man who believed he'd already won. I matched it pound for pound and held it a beat longer than I needed to. Looking him straight in the eye, I smiled the way a father smiles. He smiled the way a predator smiles. And neither of us was faking it, we were just smiling about very different things. Lorraine was already texting someone, thumbs flying across her phone screen with the good news. Paloma, probably, or their attorney in Barcelona, it didn't matter. Every person she told was another witness to a commitment the Medinas would never be able to walk back from. I picked up both coffee mugs and carried them inside. Behind me, I heard Ignacio say something to Lorraine in Spanish, low, fast, triumphant. He proposed it himself. We didn't even have to ask. No, they didn't. And the contract my lawyer was already drafting had teeth they'd never see coming. The party where they planned to celebrate their victory was going to be the last good night of Ignacio Medina's financial life. 3 days after that handshake, Faye walked into my office without knocking and shut the door behind her with both hands. She'd never shut it with both hands before. One hand means privacy. 2 hands means trouble. She set a printout on my desk, an email forwarded. Not to us, but CC'd by accident to an old company escrow address that hadn't been active in years. Someone on the Medina legal team had made a clerical error, and that error had just blown a hole in everything Ignacio had told me about timing. "The real deadline is March 1st, Faye said. "Not June, not sometime this spring, March 1st. I looked at the date on my desk calendar. 17 days. "They're racing a clock," Faye said. "Faster than anything they've told us. If the deal doesn't close by March 1st, the European creditors begin seizure proceedings against Ignacio's properties in Seville." This email was meant for his Barcelona counsel. It references the bank by name. 17 days. Everything they'd said about a relaxed timeline, about taking our time, about letting the families get comfortable, all of it was smoke. They needed my signature in 17 days, or their entire world collapsed. Let me tell you what 17 days feels like when you've spent 30 years building something. It feels like someone lit the fuse on a house you're still standing inside. I called the team in. By that afternoon, Leland, Boyd, and Faye were around the conference table, with the email printout at the center like a piece of evidence at a trial. Leland authenticated the metadata. The domain matched the Medina firm. The timestamps were consistent. The CC was a genuine mistake. "This wasn't planted," Leland said. "Someone on their end made an honest error. These are the real numbers." Boyd leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Valencia closed in 19 days. The rush is his weapon, always has been. He compresses the timeline so the target doesn't have time for due diligence. Same pattern, same playbook." "Then we let him rush straight into the wall," I said. We divided the evidence file. Leland took the contract language analysis and began drafting the counter-contract, the real document that would be presented at the public signing. The one with every clause reversed and every trap reflected back. Faye took the financial records, the wire transfers, The shell company filings, the tax liens. Boyd called his contact in Madrid to request notarized translations of the court records and to arrange a courier for the final forensic packet. The conference table disappeared under paper. Red pen marks, highlighted rows, sticky notes with dates and dollar amounts and entity names in 3 languages. It looked like the command center of a war that nobody outside this room knew was happening. Before I tell you what happened next, before I show you the moment that nearly broke me in half, I need to ask, are you still with me? Because this is where everything turns. Drop your prediction in the comments, 1 sentence. What do you think happens at that party? I want to see if anyone guesses what comes next. And a quick note, some details ahead are dramatized to deepen the emotional impact. The lesson behind them is what matters. I was watching Boyd dial Madrid when my phone buzzed on the table. A text from Declan. A photo wildflower arrangements spread across a florist's counter. Purple and white and gold, with stems still rough and petals slightly uneven, the way real wildflowers are. Dad Paloma wants wildflowers, not roses. Thoughts? I looked at that conference table, covered in fraud records and tax liens and notarized translations. Then I looked at my phone screen full of wildflowers. I couldn't hold both things in my chest at the same time. My boy was picking centerpieces for a party that was going to change his life in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. He was choosing between baby's breath and dried lavender for an evening that his father had already turned into something else entirely. And he had no idea. He was just a 29-year-old man in love. Standing in a flower shop, asking his dad's opinion, I typed back 4 words. Go with the wildflowers. Then I added a line that tasted like ash and sounded like love. Anything that grew from this soil is the real thing. I hit send and set the phone face down on the table. Leland was collating. Faye was cross-referencing account numbers. Boyd was on hold with a clerk in Madrid. And somewhere across town, my son was choosing flowers for a party where his father was going to dismantle Ignacio Medina's entire life in front of every person who mattered. Boyd's courier was still somewhere over the Atlantic when the doorbell rang. The team had spent 4 days assembling evidence, and I'd just set my phone down after texting Declan about wildflowers when the chime cut through the house like a blade. Ignacio Medina showed up at my front door at 9 o'clock that night without calling first. And he wasn't smiling. He stood on my porch in a wool overcoat that probably cost more than most people's mortgage payments. But the collar was dark with sweat, despite the February cold. His breath came out in short clouds. And when I opened the storm door, I caught something underneath his cologne, something sharp and sour, the kind of smell a body produces when it's been running on fear for too long. "Garrett, my friend," he said, stepping inside before I invited him. His shoes left wet prints on the hardwood. A small change. The bank in Barcelona, they've moved some dates around. If we could sign tomorrow at the party, it would solve everything. I leaned against the kitchen door frame and let my face do what a confused builder's face would do. The taste of old coffee still sat bitter on my tuckles, and I used the pause to study him. His left eyelid was twitching. The knot in his tie sat a 1/4 inch off center. Details a man like Ignacio would never allow unless something was cracking underneath. "Tomorrow," I said. "That's Ignacio. My lawyer hasn't even finished the draft." A formality. He waved one hand like he was swatting a fly, but the gesture was too fast, too sharp. "Between family, the details can follow. Please, Garrett, tomorrow." A man who shows up at your door at 9 at night without calling isn't visiting. He's begging. I knew exactly why he was here. That misdirected email Faye had intercepted told the whole story. The real bank deadline wasn't months away. It was days. The agreement had to close before European creditors began seizure proceedings, or everything Ignacio had spent a month building would collapse like wet scaffolding. But I couldn't know any of that. Not yet. So I rubbed the back of my neck and let him see a man wrestling with a decision he didn't fully understand. "All right," I said. slow enough that he had to lean forward to hear it. "For the kids. We'll sign tomorrow." Ignacio grabbed both my shoulders. His fingers dug into the fabric of my flannel shirt, and I could feel the tremor running through his hands like current through a bad wire. "You are a good man, Garrett. A good man and a good father." The words landed like stones in still water. He meant none of them, and I accepted all of them. And somewhere between those two facts was everything wrong with what was about to happen. I walked him to the porch. The cold hit my face like a slap raw February air, carrying the mineral smell of frozen ground and faint wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. I watched Ignacio cross the driveway to his rental sedan, and I counted. He fumbled his car keys once, twice, 3 times before the door opened. His hands were shaking badly enough that the keys caught the porch light and threw tiny flashes across the asphalt. He wasn't running toward a deal. He was running from a collapse. His taillights hadn't reached the end of my driveway before I had Leland on the phone. "It's tomorrow," I said. "He just left. Do we have enough time?" I've built on deadlines so tight that one missed delivery, one late truck, one wrong measurement means the whole thing comes down. That's where I was standing. Except the structure wasn't steel and concrete. It was my son's future. Leland went quiet. I could hear papers rustling, a desk drawer opening, the click of a pen cap. He was running through the inventory the way I'd run through a materials list before a pour, checking every item against what we had and what we still needed. "The Valencia records are in," he said. "The contract language is ready. The notarized translations Boyd's courier lands at JFK at 6 a.m. Another pause. I pressed the phone harder against my ear and stared out the kitchen window toward the guest house. The lights were on. Ignacio was probably already calling Barcelona, telling them the builder had agreed. "Just enough," Leland said. "Only just." I stood there, with the phone still warm against my ear, listening to him breathe on the other end of the line. 18 hours. Everything we'd built, the evidence file, the counter-contract, the whole architecture of this trap had to hold together before tomorrow evening. And 40 yards from where I stood, behind those lit windows, the man who thought he'd caught a fool was celebrating the worst decision of his life. Those 18 hours passed the way a fuse burns steady and silent until it isn't. Boyd's courier made it to JFK by 6. Leland had the final packet in hand by noon. And by 5 o'clock, I was standing in my backyard, watching a party come to life, while the evidence that would end Ignacio Medina sat locked in my Tacoma's glove box, 30 feet from the champagne table. My son had never looked happier than he did standing under those string lights, with Paloma's hand in his. And I have never hated an evening more in my entire life. Declan's wildflower centerpieces sat on every table. Dried lavender and goldenrod in mason jars he'd arranged himself. 40 guests moved through the yard in clusters, their laughter mixing with the jazz trio Paloma had hired to play near the garden wall. The air smelled like grilled shrimp and cold roses and the particular sweetness of a February thaw, when the frozen ground starts releasing whatever it's been holding all winter. I moved through the crowd, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, playing the proud father of the groom, while my chest felt like someone had poured concrete into it. "Dad, come here," Declan called from the head table, waving me over with a grin so wide it hurt to look at. "I want you to say a few words later. Nothing big. Just dad stuff. Dad stuff." He wanted dad stuff, and what I had in that glove box was the opposite of dad stuff. I squeezed his shoulder and told him I'd be honored. The word tasted like copper on my tongue. Throwing a party for your own son while carrying a bomb in your back pocket feels like drowning on dry land. Ignacio worked the crowd like a man running for office. He shook hands with neighbors he'd never met, complimented wives on dresses he didn't notice, and told anyone who'd listen that he and I were going into business together. "Tonight we make it official," he announced to a cluster of my subcontractors, his voice carrying across the patio like a church bell. Lorraine floated beside him in emerald silk, her smile so polished it could cut glass. I stepped toward the drink table to refill a champagne I had no intention of finishing. And that's when I heard it. Lorraine had drifted near the ice bucket with Ignacio, their shoulders touching, and she was whispering in Spanish, the way she always did when she thought no one who mattered could understand. But I understood every syllable. I'd understood every syllable since Seville. She murmured it low in her throat, in Spanish. The words meant for no one but him. Look at him smiling so naive. By tomorrow the land is ours and this fool will still be thanking us. Ignacio touched her elbow and cut her off in Spanish, quick and low. Quiet, not here. But she was already laughing. That soft, private laugh of a woman who believes she's won. The sound of it hit me like a palm against sunburned skin. Sharp, then hot, then clarifying. She called me naive. She called me a fool. And she was right about one thing. I was smiling, because that was the last insult Lorraine Medina would ever deliver from a position of power. And she had no idea. 40 guests, string lights, wildflowers my boy picked out himself, and a notary parked on the street like a getaway driver. I turned from the drink table with my full glass and let my eyes sweep the patio. Past Declan and Paloma slow dancing to something the trio was playing soft. Past Boyd near the fence, hands in his pockets, watching everything and saying nothing. Past Faye by the garden gate. Her phone dark in her hand for the first time in weeks. And there, at the far edge of the patio, standing alone with a glass of sparkling water, Leland. Our eyes met across 40 feet of string lights and laughter and the smell of wildflowers and champagne. He didn't wave, didn't smile. He lifted his chin a quarter inch. The smallest movement a human being can make and still be understood. Ready when you are. I felt it in my spine, like a current switching on. The evidence packet was ready. The counter-contract was printed. The notary Boyd had arranged was sitting in a sedan at the curb with the engine running. Every piece, every document, every translation and tax record, and fraud trail we'd assembled over 28 days was in position. I set my champagne glass on the porch railing. Still full. Not a sip taken. Then I started walking toward the table where Ignacio Medina was laughing with his arm around my son. Leland fell into step 3 paces behind me, and somewhere beyond the string lights, I could hear Lorraine still laughing at the fool who was about to ruin her life. I reached the table where Ignacio stood with his arm around Declan. I picked up a fork from the nearest place setting. Leland stopped 3 paces behind me, close enough to hand me what I needed when the time came. I tapped that glass 3 times and 40 people went quiet at once, like somebody had pulled the plug on the whole evening. I want to say a few words, I began, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. First, to the Medinas, Ignacio and Lorraine flew 4,000 miles to be here tonight. That tells you everything about the kind of family my son is marrying into. Ignacio raised his champagne toward me, his smile so wide I could count the caps on his molars. Declan, I said, turning to my boy. I watched you grow up on job sites and in the back of my truck. You learned to read blueprints before you learned to drive. And then you found someone worth building a life with. I looked at Paloma, who was pressing into Declan's side with her eyes bright. That's all a father can ask. The crowd murmured approval. Someone near the garden wall said, "Here, here." Lorraine was dabbing the corner of her eye with a cocktail napkin, and the gesture was so perfectly timed that I almost admired the craftsmanship. Ignacio raised his glass higher. 40 people were smiling. The jazz trio had gone silent. The air smelled like cold roses and melting candle wax, and the taste in my mouth was copper and resolve. Nobody saw the turn coming. You ever hold a secret for 4 weeks straight? Not a small one. A secret that rewrites everything everyone in the room thinks they know about you. It changes the way you breathe. I paused. let the warmth hang in the air for 3 heartbeats. Then I felt something shift behind my eyes. Not anger, not sadness. Something colder and more precise, and when I spoke again, my voice had changed. Since our guests came all the way from Spain, I thought I should honor them in their own language. I let that land. Then I added, quiet as a closing door. Especially since they've spent 4 weeks assuming I couldn't understand a word of it. The silence that followed wasn't the polite silence of a crowd listening to a toast. It was the silence of a room where the air has been sucked out. I watched Ignacio's smile collapse in stage. Confusion first, then recognition, then something that looked like vertigo. I switched to Spanish, flawless Castilian. The accent I'd learned in Seville 30 years ago and had been hiding like a loaded weapon since the day they arrived. "Lorraine," I said, looking directly at her. "You said I was a simple man who builds things with his hands. You were right. I built everything you came here to steal." Her champagne glass tilted in her fingers. A thin line of liquid ran down the stem and dripped onto the tablecloth. And she didn't notice. I watched the blood drain out of Ignacio's face, one shade at a time, like paint peeling off a wall in the sun. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Behind him, I could feel Declan's stare burning into the side of my head. 40 people. Not one sound, not a cough, not a glass clinking, not a chair scraping the stone. Just my voice, and the February wind, and the end of everything the Medinas thought they'd built. I kept going. I quoted the patio conversation from the first week the architectural model book, the dog bringing the wrong stick. I quoted the kitchen whispers about handling the American. And then I delivered the last one. The one from just 30 minutes ago, pointing toward the ice bucket where she'd been standing. And my personal favorite right over there. Look at him smiling, so naive. By tomorrow the land is ours and this fool will still be thanking us. Paloma's hand went to her mouth. My boy, my Declan, looked at me like he'd never seen me before in his life. The touch of the fork still cold between my fingers. I set it down on the table and straightened. "So," I said, switching back to English so every person in that backyard could hear what came next. "Now that we're all speaking the same language, let's talk about this contract." Ignacio's champagne glass was still frozen in the air, halfway to his mouth, like his body had forgotten how to finish the motion. Lorraine hadn't moved either, both hands flat on the table, knuckles bone white, staring at me with the expression of someone who just realized they'd been exposed in a room full of witnesses for a month and never knew it. Ignacio's champagne glass finally came down slowly, like a man lowering a flag. Lorraine's knuckles were still white on the table edge. Nobody in that backyard had taken a breath since I'd switched languages, and I wasn't about to give them time to start. Nobody moved. So I did. I took the folder from Leland's hands and laid it open on the table, between the wildflower centerpiece and Ignacio's untouched glass. "Let me walk everyone through what's in here," I said, and my voice carried across the patio the way it carries across a job site, clear, flat, built for distance. I turned the first page toward the crowd. "This is the incorporation record for a shell company registered in Barcelona. The owner's name is listed under Lorraine's maiden name. The filing date is 6 weeks before my son and Paloma went on their first date." I let that land. 6 weeks. Not a coincidence. A timeline. Leland stepped beside me and pointed to the notary seal. "The incorporation documents are authenticated," he said. "We obtained certified copies through legal channels in Madrid." I turned to page 14. The page I'd been staring at in my kitchen for 3 weeks. The page that had kept me awake in the cab of my Tacoma while the guest house lights burned 40 yards away. "This is the cross-collateralization clause," I said. In plain English, it means that if I'd signed this contract tonight, every piece of commercial property I own, everything I've built years, would have become collateral for debts in European banks that have nothing to do with me and everything to do with Ignacio Medina. I've torn down walls on job sites that were hiding rotten framing. You pull one board and the whole structure shows you what it really is. That's what those pages did. Ignacio opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He closed it again. First time in 4 weeks the man had nothing to say. I kept going. I pulled the next set of documents, Boyd's notarized translations. The ones his courier had hand-carried from Madrid to JFK just that morning. I laid them beside the contract like evidence at a trial, which is exactly what they were. This isn't the first family they've done this to, I said. 3 years ago, a family in Valencia. Same shell company structure, same rushed timeline, same clause on the same page. That family lost everything within 18 months. The murmuring started then. Low at first, like wind through branches, then louder. I could smell the candle wax guttering in the centerpieces, feel the cold February air pressing against the back of my neck. A woman near the garden wall whispered something to her husband. A man I'd built a kitchen for in Scarsdale set his glass down and crossed his arms. Lorraine's composure finally cracked. "This is you have no right to!" Ignacio's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, hard enough that her bracelet clinked against the table edge. "Lorraine, stop." 2 words. The sharpest thing he'd said in 4 weeks. And he said them to his own wife. Because Ignacio understood something Lorraine didn't. Every word she spoke now was another nail, and the coffin was already built. I closed the folder. Not because I was finished, but because the documents had done their work. 40 people had seen them. 40 witnesses who would remember this night for the rest of their lives. I'd spent 4 weeks planning this moment, rehearsing every word, building the case the way I build houses, load-bearing walls first, then the frame, then the finish work. But nothing I'd planned prepared me for what happened next. Declan hadn't moved. Through the entire exposure, the shell company, the cross-collateralization, the prior victims my son had, stood motionless beside Paloma, with his jaw locked and his eyes fixed on the documents like a man reading his own autopsy report. I could see his chest rising and falling too fast. I could see the vein in his temple. I could taste the bitterness climbing the back of my own throat as I watched him process every word. Then he turned. Not to me, not to Ignacio. He turned to Paloma. "Paloma," he said, and his voice was barely holding. "Look at me. Did you know about this?" The sound she made wasn't a word. It was something between a gasp and a fracture, the sound of a 27-year-old woman watching her family detonate in front of the man she loved. Her hands were shaking. Tears ran in straight lines down both cheeks. "No," she whispered. "Declan, no, I didn't. I swear I didn't know." She said it again. I didn't know, and something in the way her voice cracked told me she was telling the truth. Declan must have heard it too, because he didn't step away from her. He didn't let go of her hand. He turned back to Ignacio. The look on my son's face was something I'd never taught him and never wanted to. The look of a man who just learned exactly what kind of people raise the woman he loves. Declan was still holding Paloma's hand when he turned back to her father. And the look on my son's face was something that didn't belong at an engagement party or anywhere else where people are supposed to love each other. Ignacio Medina straightened his jacket, cleared his throat, and tried to smile. And that's when I knew. He was about to make the worst mistake of the evening. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, spreading his hands wide like a man explaining something simple to a difficult child. A family matter being twisted by lawyers and accountants who don't understand how international business works. Garrett, we are going to be family. This contract was a legitimate— Stop. Declan said it quiet. No shouting. No trembling. He said it the way I'd taught him to talk to subcontractors who lie about materials, calm. Final. Done. You don't get to say that word anymore. Ignacio blinked. In 4 weeks, I'd never seen anyone shut him down that fast. His mouth hung open for a half second. And in that gap, I heard the wind push through the string lights and the distant hum of the notary's car still idling at the curb. The smell of guttered candles drifted across the patio, wax and ash. The scent of something that used to burn bright and doesn't anymore. You know what breaks a con artist faster than evidence? Their own child looking them in the eye and asking why. Paloma stepped forward. She pulled her hand free from Declan's, not away from him, but forward, toward her parents. Tears were still running down her face, but her voice had found something solid underneath the shaking. "How could you do this to me?" she said. "You used my relationship. You used Declan. You used his father to steal. How could you do this?" The question hung in the February air like smoke. Lorraine reached for her daughter's arm, and the gesture might have been motherly if I hadn't spent 4 weeks listening to the woman call me a fool in a language she thought I didn't speak. Paloma pulled away. Sharply, the way you pull your hand back from a hot stove, not out of thought, but out of instinct. "Paloma," Ignacio said. And for the first time his voice cracked. Not the performance crack he used when he wanted to seem emotional. A real one. "You're siding with them?" She walked back across the patio. Past the wildflower centerpieces her fiancé had chosen. Past the champagne glasses nobody was drinking. She took Declan's hand again and stood shoulder to shoulder with my son, facing her parents from the other side of the table. I'm siding with the people who didn't lie to me. I'd planned every part of that evening down to the minute, the toast, the folder, the quotes in Spanish. The one thing I hadn't planned was a 27-year-old woman choosing my family over her own blood. And it damn near broke me standing there watching it. But there was one more thing to do. I nodded to Leland. He stepped forward with a single sheet of paper typed, dated, notarized that morning, and held it out to Ignacio the way you'd hand someone a parking ticket. "You have until morning," I said. "The guest house key stays on the kitchen counter." Ignacio took the eviction notice. He stared at it without reading it. The way a man stares at a bill he already knows he can't pay. Behind him, Lorraine was crying not the performed tears from the toast, not the dabbed-eye theater she'd put on an hour ago. These were real. I could see her mascara cutting dark lines down her cheeks protects, and I could taste something bitter at the back of my throat that might have been satisfaction or might have been regret. I still don't know. I leaned close enough that only Ignacio could hear me. The heat from the guttered centerpiece candles warmed my knuckles on the table. "You were right about one thing," I said. "I really would have signed anything. Just not what you had in mind." He looked at me the way a man looks at a wall he's just walked into, like he still can't believe it was there the whole time. Ignacio folded the eviction notice once, then again, then slid it into his breast pocket like a man tucking away a receipt for something he'd already lost. Lorraine was still reaching for Paloma, arm extended across the patio, fingers open, grabbing nothing but February air. And my son was standing next to me with his fiancé's hand in his, both of them shaking, neither of them letting go. Lorraine's arm was still reaching across empty air when the first guests started slipping away quiet goodbyes. Car doors closing softly. The careful retreat of people who'd just witnessed something they'd talk about for years, but had the decency not to discuss tonight. The last taillights turned off my driveway around midnight, and the silence they left behind was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. I sat on the patio for maybe 2 minutes. The wildflower centerpieces were wilting in the cold, their petals curling inward the way things do when the warmth stops reaching them. I could smell melted candle wax and frozen ground and something faintly sweet champagne that had been poured and never finished, turned flat in abandoned glasses across every table. Then I stood up and walked to the guest house. The light was on. I could see shadows moving behind the curtains, the quick, jerky movements of people packing in a hurry. I knocked twice. Ignacio opened the door in his shirt sleeves, tie gone, collar open. Behind him, 2 suitcases lay half-packed on the bed, and Lorraine was folding a silk blouse with hands that hadn't stopped trembling. I held out the paper. One sheet, typed and dated. Itemized by Faye that morning before the party, 4 weeks of guest house occupancy. The engagement celebration costs. Leland's legal fees. This covers the guest house, the party, and Leland's time, I said. You can settle it however you want, but you'll settle it. He took it without a word. The way you take a parking ticket not because you agree with it, but because refusing won't make it disappear. Delivering a bill to a man you just ruined doesn't feel like victory. It feels like pouring concrete heavy, permanent, and no way to take it back once it sets. I turned to leave. And that's when Lorraine pushed past Ignacio into the doorway. Her mascara was still streaked from the patio, her eyes swollen. And when she spoke, it was in Spanish, fast, desperate, stripped of every layer of performance I'd heard her use for the past month. Tell her I was trying to protect her, she said. Tell Paloma it was all for her. Everything we did was to secure her future. She has to understand that, please. You're a father. You understand what a parent will do. I heard every word. I understood every word. The taste of something metallic sat on my tongue, the residue of adrenaline that hadn't burned off yet. And I kept walking. Not because I was cruel. Because some apologies aren't apologies, they're just another kind of performance. Lorraine wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was auditioning for a version of the story where she was the victim, and I wasn't going to give her the stage. The guest house door closed behind me. I didn't hear it lock. I didn't need to. I'd spent 4 weeks building a case and one evening detonating it. And now I was walking through the blast radius toward 2 people sitting at a patio table where an evidence folder had been spread open an hour ago. Declan and Paloma were sitting side by side. Her hand was in his the way it always was. The way it had been since the night he'd first brought her to this house for dinner 8 months ago. The wildflower centerpiece in front of them had tipped sideways, dried lavender spilling across the tablecloth. Neither of them had fixed it. Nobody spoke. The February air pressed against my face and my hands, and I could feel the cold seeping through my flannel shirt into the skin of my arms. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked twice and stopped. The jazz trio's music stands were still set up by the garden wall. Empty now, their metal frames catching the string light's glow. Paloma broke the silence. Her voice was quiet, not broken, not fragile, just quiet in the way of someone who's finished crying and found something solid underneath. Thank you, she said, for not making me choose between Declan and the truth. You gave me both. I didn't have an answer for that. I sat down across from them and looked at those wildflowers, the ones my boy had picked out himself, and thought about how some things really do grow from good soil, no matter what tries to poison the ground. Dad, Declan said, we're okay. We're going to be okay. The 3 of us sat there under those string lights until they timed out and clicked off one strand at a time. And nobody moved to turn them back on. Inside the guest house, a door closed. Then a car engine started. Then gravel crunched down the driveway. And then it was just us. A father, his son, and the woman who'd chosen them over her own blood, sitting in the dark on a February night with nothing left to say and everything left to figure out. We figured out the darkness that night the way you figure out anything worth keeping slowly, without rushing. One honest sentence at a time. By the time we went inside, the February cold had gone through our coats and into our bones. But nobody had wanted to be the first to stand up. Paloma was the first one up the next morning. I found her in my kitchen at 6 making coffee in the same pot Ignacio had used 4 weeks earlier. And somehow, that was the thing that almost broke me. She'd slept in Declan's old room. Her suitcase was open on the floor. She'd packed it before the party, not knowing why. Just sensing something in the air, the way some people sense weather. Smart girl. Smarter than her parents ever gave her credit for. Declan came down 10 minutes later, and the three of us sat at my kitchen table with mugs that warmed our hands and steam that fogged the window over the sink. Morning light came through the glass and lit the counter where Lorraine had once stood, whispering in Spanish about handling the American. I told them everything. From the beginning, the first overheard insult at the patio, the phone call to Boyd, Faye's intercepted email, Leland's page-by-page demolition of the contract. I held nothing back. They deserved all of it. Paloma set her mug down. "I'm sorry," she said, "for all of it. For what they tried to do to you, to your family." "Your family now," I said. And I meant it. Declan was quiet for a long time. I could hear the furnace cycling and a cardinal singing outside the kitchen window, and the particular silence of a young man rearranging his understanding of the past month. "You didn't warn me," he said finally. "You have. The first week. Why didn't you? You spend your whole life teaching your kids to be honest. And then one day, you have to lie to them for a month straight to keep them safe. The worst part is, it works. Because if I'd told you without proof, you would have had to choose between believing me and believing her," I said. "I wasn't going to put that on you." He looked at me across the table. Really looked. The way he used to look at me on job sites when he was 14, and I was showing him how to read a foundation pour. Then he nodded once. And something between us that had been held tight for 4 weeks finally let go. That evening I took Leland, Boyd, and Faye to a steakhouse on Mamaroneck Avenue in White Plains. No speeches, no ceremony. Just a man buying dinner for the 3 people who'd saved his family's future. The restaurant smelled like charred beef and bread, warm from the oven. And for the first time in a month, I tasted food without the metallic edge of adrenaline underneath it. Boyd told a story about a deal gone sideways in Seville that ended with a goat in a hotel lobby. And Faye laughed so hard she had to press her napkin to her eyes. Leland ordered the chocolate torte. First dessert I'd seen him eat in 15 years of knowing the man. "You know," Boyd said, swirling his wine, "in 30 years of consulting, that's the first time a client has beaten a con artist with a toast and a flower text." Faye shook her head. "I almost didn't open that email. It hit the spam filter first." A good foundation doesn't announce itself. It just holds. Leland, Boyd, Faye. They were the foundation I didn't know I'd poured until the whole structure started shaking. I picked up the check without anyone seeing it. Some debts you can itemize. This one you just carry. The next morning I walked into the company office early. The conference room was empty. The long table clean. The chairs pushed in, no red pen marks, no fraud documents, no stacks of notarized translations. Just morning light coming through the blinds the way it has for 22 years. On the shelf by the window sat the architectural model of my first commercial project, the building that started everything along the I-287 corridor. Click-in used to run through the real thing's framing when he was 7, before the drywall went up, his sneakers echoing off the concrete slab. Sometime during the Medina weeks, the model had been knocked crooked. I hadn't noticed until now. I reached up and straightened it with 2 fingers. It clicked into place like nothing had ever touched it. Some things you build right the first time. They hold. I stood there with my hand still on the model, and my phone buzzed in my pocket. Boyd's name on the screen. I answered, and before I could say good morning, he cut in. "You're going to want to sit down," he said. "I just got word from Madrid. The Medinas, it's over for them, all of it. And there's something else you need to hear." Boyd told me to sit down, so I sat. He laid it out clean. The Barcelona creditors had moved on the deadline date, just like the intercepted email predicted. The import company, the accounts, the shell corporation under Lorraine's maiden name, all of it, seized. Ignacio Medina's 30-year business was gone in a single morning. You want to know how a story like this ends? Whether it ends clean or whether it leaves marks? It leaves marks. Every time. 3 days after Boyd's call, a letter arrived at my office. No return address. But the postmark was JFK, and the handwriting was small and careful on cream-colored stationery. Lorraine. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't explain. She didn't rewrite the history or audition for sympathy the way she had on the guest house doorstep. She asked one question. Is my daughter happy? 4 words. I read them once, folded the letter along its creases, and put it in my desk drawer. I didn't answer it, but I didn't throw it away either. Some things you hold on to not because you know what to do with them, but because throwing them out would make you the kind of person you spent 4 weeks trying not to become. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday in mid-March, my son got married. The ceremony was small, maybe 20 people. No imported jazz trio, no champagne towers, no guests of honor flying 4,000 miles with hidden agendas. Just my backyard again, cleaned up. The patio stones still holding the memory of everything that had happened there. Paloma walked herself down the aisle between 2 rows of folding chairs. Nobody gave her away, because nobody owned her. She'd made that clear the night she crossed the patio and chose my family over the people who raised her. You think revenge is the satisfying part. It's not. The satisfying part is watching your son marry someone who chose honesty over blood. That's the part that stays with you. After the ceremony, while Declan was talking to Leland near the garden wall and Boyd was making Faye laugh with another one of his Seville stories, Paloma found me alone by the drink table. She was still in her dress, simple white. Nothing like the emerald silk her mother would have chosen. And she had that look on her face, the one that means someone's about to say something they've been holding on to. I want to learn Spanish, she said. Real Spanish, so no one in this family ever has to hide anything again. I looked at her, this 27-year-old woman who'd had her family detonated in front of 40 witnesses and come out the other side standing, and I felt something shift in my chest that I hadn't felt in 6 weeks. I'll teach you, I said. We'll start with the insults. Those are the important ones. She laughed. My boy laughed from across the yard because he heard her and laughed at the sound of it. And I laughed too. The first real one in 6 weeks. The kind that hurts your chest because it's been locked in there too long. The March air smelled like wet grass and warming soil. And for the first time since the Medinas arrived, I could taste something that wasn't copper or adrenaline or cold coffee. It tasted like spring. I've built houses that outlived the people who hired me to build them. The structures hold because the foundations were right. That's not poetry, that's physics. The following Monday, I came into the office early. I took the architectural model off my shelf, the one I'd straightened a few weeks earlier. The one Declan used to run through when it was real framing and he was 7 years old and I carried it downstairs to the company lobby. I set it in the glass display case by the entrance. The one that had been empty for years because I'd never found anything worth putting there. The morning light came through the front windows and hit the glass the same way it used to hit my Tacoma's windshield on those nights I sat alone in the driveway, listening. They said I had no taste. They said I was naive. They called me a fool who builds things with his hands. And now everyone who walks through this door sees what I built with these hands. On this soil, in every language I know. I stood there in the quiet lobby and thought about Lorraine's letter still sitting in my desk drawer upstairs, unanswered, unthrown, just waiting. Some stories end with a door closing. This one ends with a man standing in front of everything he built. Understanding at last that the most dangerous thing you can do to someone who underestimates you is let them keep talking. I understood every word, every single one. And to you listening to my story, remember this. I spent 4 weeks pretending I didn't understand the people who were trying to rob me blind. I smiled at their jokes. I poured their wine. I let them sleep in my guest house while they plotted to take everything I'd spent 30 years building. If I could go back, I'd tell myself this. Don't mistake silence for weakness, and don't mistake patience for ignorance. My mistake wasn't waiting. My mistake was almost believing that confrontation wasn't worth the cost. It always is when you're protecting your family. This wasn't just a revenge story about a man who caught his in-laws scheming in a language they thought he didn't speak. This was a lesson about trust. Who deserves it, who abuses it, and what happens when you have the courage to draw the line. I believe God put me through this so I could stand in front of my son and his wife and show them that honesty will always last deception. Every revenge story has a moment where you choose between bitterness and clarity. I chose clarity. And the people who underestimated me learned that the quietest man in the room was listening the entire time. That's the real revenge story. Not the explosion, but the patience that came before it. If this story hit close to home, tell me about it in the comments. I want to hear your experience. Have you ever caught someone underestimating you and lived to prove them wrong? Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Some details in this story were fictionalized to protect identities and to highlight the message. The lesson, that's the part that's real.